The innocence of kids appeals to all of us. They're blissfully unaware of all the dross we have to deal with as grown-ups. When we see that innocence snatched away from a child, it's like a knife through our heart.
Torment will come on to me from this, and I'll be hanged for it.
When we see that innocence brutalised, it makes us angry and vengeful. Seeing children suffer isn't something any of us care for, or so we like to think. I often think that because we imagine that we live in a thoroughly wicked world, that we sometimes try to take comfort in the fact that there are always going to be just a few things which everybody holds sacred. But the reality is, there aren't. Because there are people out there for whom absolutely nothing is sacred. And they're precisely the sort of people who are more than willing, will even take pleasure in the murder of a child. And we can't even take any comfort from the fact, as we sometimes try to convince ourselves, that these murders are a modern phenomenon, that they're something that only happens in our society. And if we can only just sort it out, it'll all be okay and they won't happen anymore. Well, that's simply not true. Child murder, in all its shocking brutality, is something that's happened throughout our entire history. Not far from Winchester is the village of Alton, a place which gave us a phrase that everyone knows, but hardly anyone knows why. Polite people like myself, and yourselves of course, will sometimes use a phrase when something's absolutely and utterly worthless. We'll be heard to say, it's worth sweet FA that. Well, it doesn't mean what the less polite people we know think it means. It's actually a shortened form of an old Victorian expression. The expression sweet Fanny Adams. Why do we use that expression? Well, it's all down to the poor little babe that lies under this cross. A little 8-year-old girl who was the victim of the most horrendous Victorian murder that you'll ever come across. Fanny, her sister Lizzie and their friend Minnie loved to play in the wildflower meadows that surrounded Alton back then. Now this is the area where Fanny lived. Her friend Minnie lived here on Amory Hill Lane, and Fanny and her sister Elizabeth lived in this place, Townhouse Lane. Now on Saturday the 24th of August, a hot, close Saturday afternoon, the three of them went from their home down this lane, through the hop gardens and into a place called Flood Meadow to pick blackberries. These are the watercress beds on the edge of the flood meadows. This was a quiet, rural town. Nothing ever happened here. It was safe. There's hardly any crime to speak of, and certainly not the sort of crime that was about to happen. The parents of those little girls would have felt perfectly safe, as would have any parent in the whole of Alton, letting their kids come down here to play. What they couldn't have known was that particular afternoon there would be a gentleman approach the girls, a man in a suit, a frock coat, a top hat, the very picture of respectability. And remember, this is Victorian England. Working class girls have a certain amount of inbuilt deference to people in a suit and with good genteel manners. When this man offered them some money, two of the girls took a penny halfpenny from him and, so we think, went off to spend it on sweets. Fanny stayed with the man, and that was to prove her undoing. A local solicitor's clerk, Frederick Baker, had taken Fanny into a hop garden and ripped her apart. Victorian England was appalled. All except the Royal Navy, whose black humour christened their inedible tinned rations sweet F.A. Baker was brought to trial here at Winchester. Now, all of the evidence against him was circumstantial, but there was one piece of evidence which was particularly damning. It was an entry in his own hand, in his own work diary. He'd gone back to the office that night, the solicitor's office, and written, "Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot." Now, clearly, this was the entry of someone who was utterly deranged, and I suspect the judge must have thought so as well, because although he didn't actually direct the jury, he dropped an incredibly broad hint to them. He said, "If you believe this man is insane, you must return a verdict of not guilty." Well, they ignored the hint. They brought back a guilty verdict, and the judge reached for the black cap, placed it on his wig, and pronounced sentence of death on Frederick Baker. Insane or not, Frederick Baker was brought from his cell in Winchester jail and hanged before a crowd of 5,000 people. Many of them were women and children, and a good number of them had actually walked the 15 miles from Alton to be present at the execution of the beast. They hanged him on Christmas Eve, 1867. Clearly, the vengeful people of Hampshire weren't prepared to extend the season of goodwill to Frederick Baker. To this day, the people of Alton remember Fanny and put flowers beside her grave whenever they happen to be passing. What was done to her was truly unspeakable. I haven't told you all the gory details because honestly, you don't need to know. But what you do need to know, what we all need to remember, is that these sort of horrendous crimes against children aren't a modern phenomenon. God help us, they've been with us for centuries. If the tale of Fanny Adams has the ability to make us shudder 100 years after the event, then, what the judiciary were capable of doing to children ought to have the same effect on us, because it certainly was anything but pleasant. Here we are, this is the tale of John Anybird Bell. Don't ask me why he was called Anybird, nobody seems to know. It's the only humorous thing in this whole story, believe me. John Bell was out with his brother walking one day in 1831, and they fell in, as the phrase has it, with a young boy by the name of Richard Falkland Taylor. Now, Richard had been sent by his dad, they lived near Rochester, to go and collect his parish relief. He'd been to cash his dad's gyro, in effect. It was the dole. On the way back, the two lads met up with Richard and said, "Oh, come for a walk in the woods." So they all went in to cut walking sticks, was the story. We don't quite know what happened after that. Richard began to cry. Perhaps they got lost. It was a very deep woodland. Bell told him to be quiet. And when he couldn't stop his crying, Bell pushed him to the ground, took out his pocket knife and cut his throat. He was only 13, this kid, was lying there saying, "Please, please don't harm me. My da knows your da, and I promise I'll be good if you don't harm me." But his pleas just fell on deaf ears. Bell cut his throat and watched him die. He recorded later in his statement that the boy made a noise like a frightened rabbit as he bled to death. Bell was convicted of murder, but when the jury pleaded for clemency, it was their pleas that fell on deaf ears. The law determined to take Bell's life, Old Testament justice, an eye for an eye, a life for a life, even when it was a child's life.
Hide my face from my sin and blot out all mine.
This tragic tale reached its final conclusion on the morning of August the 1st, 1831. They led John Anybird Bell from his condemned cell outside the main gate of the prison at Maidstone. Remember, it's a public execution in those days. And he knelt down at the foot of the gallows, said his prayers, and then they helped him up onto the trapdoor and placed the noose around his neck. While he was standing there, he looked out across the crowd.
All you people, take warning by me. Take warning.
And with those words, this poor, simple lad was launched into eternity. Afterwards, the dissectionists, the quacks, looked at the body and pronounced that the organs of destructiveness and cunning were very prominent. In the parish church at Loddon in Norfolk, you'll find evidence of a 12th century murder that remains unsolved to this day. In the 1500s, Holy Trinity had the most breathtakingly beautiful screen down here by the altar. But like so many churches throughout East Anglia, well, throughout the whole country, the parishioners had to simply sit back and watch while the religious reformers had ripped down and tore apart and destroyed those screens. But one panel survived here that shows us something which is anything but glorious, shows us a truly bloody crime. It shows us the ritual murder of a child martyr. It shows us one of the most shameful moments in Christian history. This place is called Mousehold Heath. It's a big open space that lies just outside the walls of the city of Norwich. Now, it was on an Easter Saturday that an old man had come up here gathering sticks for firewood. And somewhere in one of the clumps of firs that are dotted across the whole of this open space, he found the body of a young boy. The mutilated body of a young boy who'd clearly been tortured to death. There were stab wounds in his head. It looked as if someone had poured boiling water over him. His head had been partly shaved, and there was a teasel jammed into his mouth to use as a gag. The old man didn't know who the boy was, but it was very clear that he died in agony. It was Easter in the year 1144, and by the following year, the people of Norwich would have a new saint to pray to. We know the broad outline of what happened because many years after the murder, a Norwich monk, Thomas of Monmouth, wrote up the story for the cathedral. The child's body was identified as William of Haveringland, a 12-year-old skinner apprenticed in the Norwich fur trade. Remember, back in the Middle Ages, they didn't even have glass in their windows, so they wore a lot more fur to keep warm. Clearly, William would have been a very busy lad. And that's another point that Thomas makes. He was busy with a very particular section of the medieval community, a group of people who most of the population feared and a few actually despised. William did a lot of trade with the Jews of Norwich. Now, Christian law made it a sin to lend money to other Christians at interest, so the wealthy crown used Jewish moneylenders as middlemen, then left them to take the rap from everybody else. That's why Jewish ghettos were protected by royal castles. The Jews lived in permanent fear of the mob. You can feel the hatred, that's not too strong a word, the hatred that people still had for the Jews. And remember, this panel is painted 400 years after the murder. We know that because of the clothing that the people were wearing. They're wearing Tudor costume. You can see the shoes here and the Tudor gowns. But what's really horrible, what's actually quite obscene, is the depiction of the Jews who are shown ritually murdering this child. The way their faces have been caricatured with big noses and with leering grins. And here, just to make this even more like the crucifixion, which people believed it was parodying, you can see the added myth that's grown up over the years, that the Jews, just the way Christ's side was pierced and blood and water flowed out, that the Jews pierced the side of William and collected the blood in a little bowl, and that they then took the blood away and used it for secret ritual purposes. This is the myth, the blood libel, that children, Christian children, are ritually murdered every year by Jews who then use their blood for their own designs. I think modern forensic science can give us the impression that solving a murder has always been easy. The sad truth is, it hasn't. The murder of William, well, the only reliable information that we've got, well, the only information that we've got, is an account written many years after the event by a Norwich monk. And let's be honest, he was keen to prove that William was a saint, so he was hardly dispassionate in his arguments. One of the witnesses he brought forward was the Lady Lagarda, a holy widow who worked caring for the sick down at the Lazar House. She claimed to have seen a holy light that shone down over the heath on Easter Saturday morning. Another witness was Henry de Sprouston, who was a forester. He came onto the heath and met the old man who first found the body, and went to look at it himself, saw ravens, so he claimed, that tried to feast on the body, but were unable to for some reason. By the time Thomas of Monmouth was scribbling down the evidence, the cult of little St. William the Martyr was in full swing, and nobody was going to rock the boat, least of all question the long-held popular belief that the last place William had been seen alive was in the heart of the jury. Suddenly everyone was an expert witness. One of the witnesses was a young girl, a young maidservant, actually in one of the Jews' houses in Norwich. She claimed that William had actually been murdered in her master's house. She knew this, she said, because all through the day there'd been all sorts of hubbub coming and going from one of the rooms there. And then the people inside began calling for boiling water. Well, being the maidservant, she was the one who had to run it up to them. And she said that as they opened the door, they didn't open it very far, they took the water from her. But once that door was open for that brief second, with one eye through a crack in the door, she said she had seen William nailed to a bedpost, being tortured and persecuted by her master and his friends. She didn't see any more than that because they were quick to slam the door shut on her. All through the night of Good Friday, another witness, Aylward Dead, a wealthy Norwich merchant, had gone to every single church in the city. This was an old tradition. People went to perform the rituals and prayers appropriate to this solemn Christian occasion. Dawn found Aylward and his servant going across Mousehold Heath towards St. Leonard's Chapel to pray there. En route, Aylward was astonished to see two people he knew riding horses across the heath. He was astonished because they were Jews. Jews did not come out of their houses on Good Friday. Come on, it was never a good time to be a Jew in medieval England, but Easter weekend was the worst time of all. So he went over to them, stopped them, wanted to find out what was going on. As they drew rein, he put his hand on a sack on the saddlebow, and he later claimed he felt what he thought was a body inside the sack. The Jews took fright, clapped their spurs into their horses, and galloped off into the thickest part of the wood. These so-called witnesses trotted out all the old lies and prejudices of the mob. The same mob that had rampaged round the city blaming the Jews for the murder. To be fair to the bishop, Eberhard, he had his doubts about the whole thing right from the outset, and he was not impressed to find he had a mob clamouring at the door of his cathedral, banging on about children murdered in our midst, and it's the Jews what done it. No, his first instinct was tell them all to forget about it and be off about their business. You know, let's face it, to a man of his education and background and his political position, he wasn't about to listen to the opinions of the great unwashed. Doing that would have far too strong a whiff of the tail wagging the dog. This would be on a par with Tony Blair today inviting the Jerry Springer audience up to Downing Street to get the benefit of their opinion on how to move the Northern Ireland peace process forward. The Bishop of Norwich wasn't about to do the same thing just because it was back in 1144. And the very week that all this was going on, there was a synod taking place right here in the choir of the cathedral. All the priests of the diocese were here for a big meeting. And one of those priests was Godwin, William's uncle. He stood up in front of our packed house, everyone hanging on his every word. Talk about assured of maximum publicity. And he set out his own version of events, a virulently anti-Semitic story. A story which the bishop was eventually and reluctantly forced to accept. You see, his advisors pointed out to him the financial advantages of creating a child martyr. A martyr with his very own shrine, a premier pilgrim visitor attraction, a nice little earner. In time, 50 other cities followed their lead. Each had their own cult, whose followers had a tailor-made, church-approved excuse to persecute the Jews. William's murderer was never brought to justice. And when the Reformation swept away all those cults, the story was all but forgotten. Do you think it's better just forgotten about and buried and lost like William himself? No one knows where the body is now.
No, we shouldn't forget William, because William reminds us of things that, sadly, recur throughout all ages and generations, and he can help us. It's a tragic story, but often tragedy helps humanity learn. William, and all that he stands for, is someone we dare not forget, but that we need to use him to look positively forward, to live with each other happily.